She was traded to a Lakota warrior for being too old, but he said, "A is how I know you survived." The horse came back without me. That's how Miriam said she first knew something was wrong. She told me this months later, standing in the doorway of the cabin with her arms crossed and the lamplight behind her, and she said it plain, no drama in it. The horse came back, and she looked at it for a long time before she picked up her rifle and walked out into the dark. I'm getting ahead of myself, I do that. My name is Chayton. My father named me for the hawk, which he thought was a fine thing to name a son. I spent 40 years trying to be what that name meant: fast, sharp, above the mess of things below. I wasn't always those things, but I tried to be. This happened in the autumn of my 53rd year. I tell it now because someone ought to know it happened, and because keeping it to myself has started to feel like a wrong I'm doing her. We were coming off a long season. My nephew Lakota and I had been working the eastern range of the territory, trading horses. I'd spent 20 years raising and training horses, and there wasn't a man in 400 miles who'd argue with the quality of what I brought to market. That was one thing I had. The horses knew me, and I knew them, and there was never any deception in it. The trouble started at a river crossing 3 days east of home. We'd stopped to water the animals. There were 6 horses we were bringing back. 3 I'd sold north and 3 I was keeping for the winter. Lakota had gone upstream to check the ford. I was crouched by the bank, my hand in the cold water, watching the light come down through the cottonwoods in that particular way it does in October, yellow and a little thin, like it knows it won't last. I heard them before I saw them. 4 men. White men, trail-worn, and the kind of tired that makes men stupid and mean. They came down from the ridge line, and 2 of them already had rifles out. They didn't want the horses. They wanted to make a point. There are men like that in this world, not poor men, not desperate men, but men with a sickness in them that only comes out when they believe there are no consequences. They'd been drinking. One of them called me a word I won't repeat. They said this was their river. They said an Indian had no business trading horses like a white man. I've been in fights. I don't shy from them. But 4 men with rifles, and Lakota upstream where he couldn't hear, and the horses still roped together. It wasn't a fight I could win by being a hawk. I tried to walk them back. I kept my voice level. I put my hand up slow. The one closest to me swung his rifle like a club. I don't remember the sound it made. I remember the cottonwood leaves yellow, and then the water very cold, and then nothing at all. When I woke up, I was on my back in the mud, and the light had gone down to that gray that comes before full dark. My head felt like something had come loose inside it. My hands were empty. They'd taken the lead ropes on the horses, all 6 of them, and gone. Lakota found me 20 minutes later. He was 17. He pulled me to the bank and sat with me while I tried to remember how to hold my own head up, and then he got me onto the horse we had left, the old bay mare who'd come back to him on her own, and we started west. 3 days it took. 3 days of me drifting in and out of something I wouldn't call sleep, leaning over the mare's neck, Lakota walking beside me most of the way because the country was too rough to risk a fall. When we crossed into familiar ground, Lakota went ahead to my brother's camp to tell them what had happened. And that's when the horse came back without me. Not the bay. I'd slid off somewhere in a narrow canyon half a mile back, and the mare had come on ahead, and Lakota hadn't seen it because he was already a quarter mile in front of me and moving fast. I lay in that canyon for what I figure was 2 hours. I couldn't get up. My head was wrong and my right side wouldn't take weight, and it was cold, that October cold that reaches into the ground and comes back up through your back when you're lying on it. I remember thinking, without much feeling about it, that this was a poor place to finish things. Just a narrow slot of rock and dried brush, no view of anything, the sky a strip of gray above me. After all those years of open country, a crack in the ground. I heard her before I saw her, same as with the other men, but this was different. This was the sound of someone moving, careful and purposeful, a lamp swinging, boots on rock. And then her face above me and the lamp, and she said it in a flat, practical voice, "You're not dead." I said, "Not yet." She said, "All right then," and set the lamp down and knelt beside me. Her name was Miriam Voss. She was 51 years old, a widow of 6 years, and she ran a small holdings place 2 miles from my brother's camp. She'd been there 4 years by then. I knew of her. Everyone in that stretch of country knew of her, but I'd never had more than 20 words with the woman. Later I found out what had brought her to that canyon at full dark with a lamp and a rifle. She'd seen the mare come in riderless. She'd asked Lakota, who just arrived, where I'd been last. He'd pointed west and she'd gone. She told me later it wasn't complicated. "Someone was out there," she said. "You don't leave a person out there." That's the kind of woman she was. Practical in the deepest way, where practical and decent turn out to be the same thing. She got me to my feet. That's not a small thing. I'm not a small man, and I had nothing to give her, just the ability to not go completely dead weight if she told me in that flat, certain voice that I needed to stand. She got my arm over her shoulder and we went slow, and we got out of that canyon and across the open ground to my brother's camp. I spent 11 days at Miriam's place. Not my brother's. My brother's wife had 4 children in close quarters and no extra space. And Miriam had a cabin she'd built herself with a spare room, and the kind of quiet that a man with a bad head needs like water. She didn't fuss. I want to be clear about that. There's a kind of care that wraps itself around you until you can't breathe, and that's not what she did. She brought food and she changed the cloth she kept against the side of my head, and she told me once a day whether I seemed better or worse than the day before. That was the extent of her nursing. The rest of the time she let me sleep or sit in the chair by the window and watch the light change on the hills, and she got on with her work. I watched her work. The first few days I was too far down to notice much. But by the 5th day the worst of the confusion had cleared, and I could sit up without the room tilting, and I started to see her properly. She was not a soft woman. There was nothing in her hands or her face that hadn't been used and used again. She had a scar on her left forearm from what I later learned was a harness that had slipped when she was pinned. Her husband had been the one who got her free, and she'd been grateful to him, she said, right up until the moment she wasn't. There was something in the way she said that, no bitterness and no apology, that told me more about her than most people tell you in a year. She split her own wood. I watched her from the window on the 7th day, the axe coming down and the pieces flying and her stacking them without stopping, a rhythm she'd made so familiar it had gone automatic. I thought, that woman has been doing for herself a long time. She didn't look like she was waiting for anyone to do it for her. She looked like she'd stopped waiting years ago and had decided the woodpile didn't care either way. It was on the 8th day that she told me what the traders had said about her. She said it the same way she said everything, looking at the pot she was stirring rather than at me, and the words came out just matter of fact, like she was telling me about weather. There was a group of them, buyers and sellers she'd dealt with at the Eastern market, men she'd trusted enough to shake hands with. They had decided, collectively, that she was past her usefulness. Past it. That's the word they used when they thought she wasn't in earshot. Past it, and not worth the trouble of keeping any sort of account with. One of the older traders had told her straight to her face. He'd been drunk and he'd meant it as a joke, and he'd said she was done. She was too old to be worth haggling over. She ought to find a man who'd take her off the market before she lost all her value entirely. She didn't say how she'd responded to that. She just said it and kept stirring, and then she said, "I want you to know I don't tell you that for sympathy." I said, "I know that." She said, "I tell you because I think you understand something about being looked at and not seen." I sat with that for a while. The fire was going and the pot was going, and outside the wind had come up and was working at the corners of the cabin. I said, "What do they think they're looking at when they look at you?" She put the spoon down and turned around then. And she looked at me, really looked, the way a person does when they're deciding whether to tell the truth, and she said, Something used up. I said, they're wrong. She didn't answer that. She picked up the spoon again, but something shifted in the room. I felt it, and I think she did too. On the 9th day, I walked the perimeter of her place without stopping to rest. The right side still ached, but it held. I looked at what she'd built here, and I looked at it honestly. It was a good place. She'd chosen well. The cabin sat on a low rise with clear sightlines in 3 directions. The creek close enough to be useful and far enough not to flood. The kitchen garden on the south side where the sun held longest. Everything placed with thought. That night I asked her why she'd stayed, after her husband died, this far from any town. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "Because this is mine, because I built it, because nobody gets to tell me it isn't." I understood that. In my bones I understood it. The way you understand something that has also been true of your own life. That the ground under your feet means something different when you've had someone try to take it from you. I said, "No, they don't get to tell you that." She looked at me again that way, the weighing look, and then she almost smiled, not quite, but almost, and that was the first time I thought she might be beautiful. Not the way young women are beautiful, all surface and urgency. The way a piece of country is beautiful when you've been moving through it long enough to understand what shaped it. On the 10th day, Lakota came. He was uncomfortable. 17-year-olds are not built for subtlety, and my nephew had never tried for it anyway. So what he brought with him was written all over his face before he opened his mouth. He told me that the men in camp, my brother, 2 cousins, an older man named Heron who had influence and liked to use it, they had talked. They said I was getting old. He said it quickly, the way you say a thing you don't want to say. They said I was getting old and the horses were gone, all 6 of them, and I'd let myself be taken down by white men at a river, and my usefulness to the group was a question now that it hadn't been before. They hadn't sent him to tell me to go, not quite. But they had sent him to tell me that Miriam Voss would house me as long as I needed, and that when I was ready to travel, there was no pressing need for me to come back to camp before spring. No pressing need. Lakota couldn't look at me when he said it. He's a good boy. He kept his eyes on the floor. I sat with it. I could feel the shape of it, the thing I'd spent 20 years building, the reputation, the horses, the standing that comes from being competent and consistent and never asking for anything you didn't earn. I could feel the shape of it tipping, like a table with one leg kicked out. I thanked him. I told him to tell them I understood and that I'd be in touch when I had something useful to offer. After he left, I sat in the chair by the window for a long time. Long enough that the light went out of the sky and came back in the lamp. I didn't eat. I didn't talk. Miriam left me alone. She cooked and she moved around the cabin and she didn't ask me anything or try to fill the silence, and I cannot tell you how much that mattered. How much it means when you're sitting inside the worst of something, to not have someone reach in and grab at it. Finally, she set a plate down on the table next to me and said quietly, "You're going to eat that." Not a question, just a statement of what was going to happen. I looked at her. She said, "Whatever they said, you're going to eat that, and then you're going to sleep. And in the morning, things are going to look like what they actually are instead of what they look like right now in the dark." I said, "How do you know what they said?" She said, "Because I know what men say when they decide a person is finished." She sat down across from me, not leaning in, not crowding me, just there in her chair, with her hands in her lap and her eyes level on mine. She said, "They said that to me too. Different words, same thing." I said, "And?" She said, "And I'm still here, and my woodpile is full. And my kitchen garden came in better this year than any year before it, because I've been learning this ground for 4 years, and I finally know what it needs." I picked up the fork. I didn't have words right then. I didn't try for them. I ate what she'd made, which was good, and I sat in the warmth of the fire she'd laid, and I let myself feel just for a moment, not wallowing, not performing what it was to be in a room with someone who didn't look at you and see something used up. In the morning, I went out early and split a month's worth of wood. I didn't tell her I was going to. I just went out before she was up and I split wood until I'd done the whole pile she'd set aside for winter, and then I stacked it clean against the south wall of the cabin, and when she came out to find me, she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the stacked wood, and then she looked at me. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded once, the way you nod to someone you consider an equal, and went back inside to make the morning fire. I noticed that, the nod. It was the right response and I noticed it. That afternoon I told her I was going after the horses. She didn't tell me I was crazy. She didn't tell me I wasn't well enough. She asked me what I knew about which direction they'd gone, and I told her, and she asked how many men, and I told her 4, and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, I know a man with a trading post a day east of where you're describing. He'll have heard something. Men like that always sell their news before they sell their goods. I said, you know this territory. She said, I've been learning it. That word again, learning. Not conquering, not surviving. Learning. Like the territory was a conversation she was having over a long stretch of time. She said, I'd like to come. I looked at her. She said, not because I don't think you can do it. Because it's my territory too, and I know it better than you've seen so far, and because 2 people are harder to bushwhack than 1. I said it could go badly. She said, I've had things go badly before. I said, all right. We left at first light the next morning. I won't tell you the whole of those 4 days, riding east through October country, the frost on the grass in the mornings, and the high clouds moving and the afternoons short and gold. I'll tell you the parts that matter. The trading post man was named Faulkner. He was a small, dry man with eyes that moved faster than his mouth, and he'd heard plenty. The 4 men had come through 2 days ahead of us, 6 horses in tow that they had no clean story for, and they were heading toward a settlement called Greer's Crossing, which was a place Miriam knew. She knew it because she'd bought timber there once, and the man who ran the mill had an arrangement with the law in that district that meant the law was useless to us, and we were going to have to think of another way. She thought of it on the second night, sitting by the fire with a tin cup in her hands and her eyes on the middle distance. She had a stillness about her when she thought, not absence, not going away from you, but a gathering like something was pulling together behind her eyes. She said, there's a man at Greer's Crossing who has a dispute with the mill owner going back 3 years over a timber contract. His name is Aldous Webb, and he lost money on the deal, and he's been looking for a reason to make trouble for that whole operation. I said, you know a lot of people. She said, I pay attention. She said Webb would have seen the horses come in. He'd know something wasn't clean about them, and if we could get to him before the other men knew we were there, we had a lever. It worked. I'll say that simply, it worked. Not without its moments. There was 1 hour when I thought the whole thing was going to come apart, when 2 of the 4 men saw us in the yard, and I had to put myself between them and Miriam with nothing but the look on my face and the particular way I hold still when I am very serious about something. They backed off. I don't know if it was wisdom or a recognition of something. But they backed off, and Webb appeared at the right moment with his dispute and his leverage. And by midday, we had the 6 horses and the law from the neighboring district that Webb had quietly alerted, and the 4 men were sitting in Aldous Webb's barn, while someone who actually served the law rode hard toward Greer's Crossing from 20 miles west. We left before any of that was sorted. It wasn't our business to sort it. 2 days home, the horses ahead of us on lead lines, the country opening up into that wide, familiar emptiness I've lived in all my life. On the first evening of those 2 days, we stopped at a stream I know, with good grass and a stand of ash trees that had gone yellow-orange, and we made camp. Miriam made the fire. She was faster at it than me, and we both knew it by then, and we sat and ate, and the horses grazed, and the stars came on one at a time the way they do when you have room enough to see the whole sky. She said after a while, "What are you going to do when you get back?" I said, "About my brother." She said, "About all of it." I thought about it. I said, "Bring the horses back, that's the first thing." After that I stopped. I said, "I don't know that I want to go back to what I had. What I had was based on something they've decided isn't true anymore." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What they decided about me wasn't true either. Doesn't stop them from deciding it." I said, "No." She said, "But you can decide something too." I looked at her across the fire. She was looking at me, not the weighing look, not the practical assessing look, but something more open than that, something that had some risk in it. She said, "I've been on my own a long time. I'm not afraid of it. But I've been watching you these past few days, and I think you're the kind of man who makes things better. The things around him. The people." I didn't answer right away. I let that sit because it's not a thing you rush past. She said, "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm not asking you to save anything or fix anything. I'm just telling you what I see." I said, "What do you see?" She said, "A man who knows what he's doing. A man who kept his head when he needed to keep it. A man who split an entire winter's wood without being asked." She said it without any decoration, and it landed in me like something coming home. Not a compliment the way flattery is a compliment, hollow and constructed to produce an effect. A statement of what she had observed, from a woman who observed things accurately, and decided to say them because they were true. I moved around the fire and I sat beside her, and she didn't move away. After a moment she put her hand on my arm, not a grip, just a resting, the warmth of her palm through my sleeve, and we sat like that in the firelight while the horses grazed, and the creek ran, and the ash trees made their yellow sound in the small wind. I don't know how long we sat. Long enough that the fire went down and I built it back up, and she stayed with her hand on my arm, and neither of us said anything more that needed to be said. I went back to my brother's camp to return the horses. My brother didn't say much. Men often don't, when they know they were wrong and they're not sure yet how to say it. He looked at the 6 horses and he looked at me and he said, "You went after them." I said, "I went after them." He said, "Alone?" I said, "No." He asked who'd gone with me and I told him, and he got a look on his face that I'd seen before, the look that means he's reorganizing something. He said, "Miriam Voss." I said, "Miriam Voss." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "Heron was wrong about what he said." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you coming back to camp?" I told him I'd be close. I told him I'd be nearby, and that I'd be the same as I'd always been, and that the horses were mine to do with as I saw fit. He didn't argue. I don't know if it was the horses or the way I was standing or the simple fact of having been wrong and knowing it, but he didn't argue. I built a room onto Miriam's cabin before the first snow. She didn't ask me to. She said if I was planning to stay, there was enough timber from the season before and she knew where the saw was. That was her invitation. That was enough. We worked on it together, 5 days. And by the end of it we had a room with a window facing east and a door that hung straight and sealed out the wind. And on the last evening of the work we stood outside and looked at it, the new room attached to the cabin she'd built herself, and she crossed her arms and looked at it for a long time. She said, "It's good work." I said, "It is." She turned and looked at me then, and what was on her face was not complicated. It was the look of a woman who has been alone a long time, who has done for herself without complaint or performance, who has asked nothing from anyone, because she learned not to depend on being given anything, and who has, despite all of that, allowed herself to see something clearly and decide it was good. She stepped close and put her hand flat on my chest, the way she might check that the wall was solid and true, and she looked up at me and I looked back at her, and she said simply, "You're staying." It wasn't a question. It was the way she said the things she'd already decided. I covered her hand with mine. I said, "I'm staying." That was 11 years ago. I keep horses still. Better horses now, because I've had 11 years of knowing this ground and this water, of learning that word. Her word, what this particular country asks of an animal and a man. My nephew Lakota works with me in the summers. He's 28 now, steady in the way young men sometimes grow into steadiness, and he treats Miriam like a second mother, which she has never discouraged. My brother comes in the fall. He and I don't talk much about that year, but there's something solid between us now that wasn't there before, the way there's something solid between men who have both been wrong about something important and who have both, eventually, come to terms with it. Miriam is 62. She still splits wood faster than me, and she still has that stillness when she thinks, and she still says the true thing in the flat, certain voice that means she has considered it and decided it's worth saying. She said it again this past spring. We were watching the horses in the north pasture, 3 mares and a young gelding who'd come into his paces just that season, and she said, out of nowhere with no prologue, "I used to think the years were taking something from me." I asked her what she thought now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think they were building something instead. I just couldn't see it until I had enough of them." I put my arm around her and she leaned into me, and we stood like that in the spring evening with the horses moving in the long grass and the light laying itself down in that particular way across the hills, yellow gold and unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. That's what I know now. That's what she taught me without trying to teach me anything. What they call finished is sometimes just the beginning of the part that matters. Not a moral, just what I've seen.